Some hearts are broken so young they don't even know what wholeness feels like. This is the story of a golden retriever puppy who thought the world was nothing but cold concrete and empty stomachs until one rainy night changed everything. Behind a dumpster in Phoenix, a tiny puppy sat chained and shivering. He had been crying for days. Cars drove by, but nobody stopped. Then a man with sad eyes walked into the alley. The man was running from his own troubles. His hand shook when he knelt down beside the puppy. Neither of them knew they were about to save each other. The puppy would learn what love feels like. The man would remember what it meant to care for something again. But what was this stranger hiding that made him just as lost as the abandoned puppy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain had been falling for 3 hours when Thomas Brennan first heard the crying. It cut through the steady drumming on the metal roof of his battered 1998 Dodge van like a knife through silence. At 58, Tom had learned to ignore most sounds that interrupted his restless sleep: sirens, shouting, the crash of garbage trucks in the early morning hours. But this sound was different. This sound reached something deep inside his chest and wouldn't let go. Tom pushed himself up from the makeshift bed he'd constructed in the back of his van, wincing as his lower back protested. 6 months of sleeping on a thin mattress over plywood had left its mark on muscles that once carried 200-pound steel beams without complaint. The digital clock on his dashboard glowed 2:47 a.m., its red numbers reflecting off the rain-streaked windshield like tiny warning lights. He'd parked in this particular alley because it was quiet, tucked between 2 abandoned warehouses in downtown Phoenix, where the city's forgotten came to disappear. The kind of place where a man could live in his van without drawing unwanted attention from police or social workers with their well-meaning questions and their forms that required addresses he no longer had. The crying came again, weaker this time. Almost lost beneath the rain, Tom pulled on his work boots, scuffed leather Wolverines that had walked 1,000 job sites over 20 years of construction work. They were the one thing from his old life that still fit properly, still served their purpose. Everything else had either been lost in the divorce or didn't matter anymore. He grabbed a small flashlight from the glove compartment, the cheap plastic kind you could buy at gas stations, and opened the van's back doors. The alley stretched out before him like a mouth full of broken teeth. Dumpsters lined the walls, overflowing with the detritus of businesses that still functioned in the daylight world. The smell hit him immediately: rotting food, stagnant water, and something else he couldn't identify but recognized as the particular stench of places where hope had died. The beam of his flashlight swept across broken bottles and soggy cardboard until it found what he was looking for. Behind the largest dumpster, partially hidden by a piece of rusted corrugated metal, a small golden shape pressed against the brick wall. The puppy couldn't have been more than 3 months old, his fur matted with rain and mud, his tiny ribs visible through his soaked coat. A heavy chain, meant for securing much larger animals, wrapped around his neck and connected to a concrete block. The metal had already begun to chafe the tender skin beneath his fur, leaving raw patches that glistened in the flashlight beam. The puppy's brown eyes reflected the light, wide with a terror so complete it seemed to fill his entire small body. "Jesus," Tom whispered, his voice rougher than he remembered it being. He hadn't spoken aloud in 3 days. The puppy tried to scramble backward when Tom approached, but the chain only allowed him a few inches of movement. His tail, which should have been wagging with the natural joy of his breed, remained tucked tight against his belly. When Tom knelt down, the puppy's whimpering intensified, but he seemed too weak to do more than tremble. "Easy, boy," Tom said softly, extending his hand palm up. "I'm not going to hurt you." The puppy flinched when Tom's fingers brushed his fur, but he didn't try to bite. Tom had worked construction long enough to understand structural integrity, and what he saw now was a creature on the verge of complete collapse. The puppy's breathing was shallow and rapid, his nose dry and warm. Dehydration, malnutrition, exposure any. One of these conditions could kill something so small and vulnerable. Tom's hand shook as he examined the chain's attachment point. Not from the cold or the rain, but from something deeper, something that had been shaking inside him for months now. The chain was secured with a simple padlock, but the metal was old and the lock mechanism had rusted. He pulled a multi-tool from his pocket, another relic from his working days, and began working at the lock shackle. "Who did this to you?" he asked, though he knew the puppy couldn't answer. "What kind of person chains up a baby?" The lock gave way with a metallic snap, and immediately the puppy tried to crawl further into the corner, dragging the heavy chain behind him. Tom carefully lifted the metal collar over the puppy's head, revealing the full extent of the damage. Underneath, the skin was raw and infected, weeping with moisture that wasn't rain. "Come on, little guy," Tom said, gathering the puppy gently in his arms. "Let's get you somewhere warm." The puppy didn't fight the rescue. He pressed against Tom's chest, his small body generating almost no heat, and made a sound that was part whimper, part sigh. It was the sound of something that had given up hope and then found it again, all in the space of a single moment. Back in the van, Tom wrapped the puppy in his only spare blanket, a gray wool thing that had seen better decades but still held warmth. He turned on the engine and cranked the heater, filling the small space with blessed hot air. The puppy's shivering gradually subsided, though his breathing remained labored. Tom opened a can of tuna he'd been saving for his own dinner and placed small pieces near the puppy's mouth. At first, the puppy seemed too frightened to eat, but hunger eventually overcame fear. He ate slowly, carefully, as if he'd learned not to trust that food would remain available. "That's it," Tom encouraged. "Take your time." As the puppy ate, Tom found himself really talking for the first time in months. He told the puppy about the rain, about the van, about how strange it was to have another living creature depending on him again. He didn't mention the drinking, or the job he'd lost, or the daughter who hadn't returned his calls in 2 years. Some stories were too heavy for such small ears. The puppy finished eating and looked up at Tom with eyes that held a glimmer of something beyond fear. Not trust, not yet, but curiosity. The beginning of hope. "You need a name," Tom said, stroking the puppy's damp fur with gentle fingers. "How about Scout? You look like a scout." Scout, for that's who he was, now settled against Tom's side and closed his eyes. His breathing deepened, became more regular. For the first time in days, he felt safe enough to truly sleep. Tom leaned back against the van's metal wall and watched Scout breathe. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the city clean of its daily sins. Inside the van, two broken souls had found each other in the darkness and decided, without words, to hold on together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Scout would need medical attention, proper food, a collar that didn't cut into his neck. Tom would need to figure out how to care for another living thing when he could barely care for himself. But tonight, in the warm confines of a borrowed sanctuary, it was enough that neither of them was alone. Tom closed his eyes and listened to Scout's breathing, matching his own rhythm to the puppy's. For the first time in months, his hands had stopped shaking. 3 weeks had passed since that rainy night, and Tom was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could handle this. Scout had filled out considerably under Tom's careful attention, his ribs no longer visible through his golden coat. The raw patches on his neck had healed into pink scars that would fade with time. More importantly, Scout had begun to trust really. Trust in a way that made Tom's chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. They had established routines. Morning walks through the industrial district where other people rarely ventured. Afternoons spent in the shade of overpasses while Tom looked for day labor opportunities. Evenings in the van, Scout curled against Tom's side while the older man read aloud from newspapers he found in dumpsters. It wasn't much of a life, but it was their life, and for the first time in months, Tom felt like he had a purpose beyond simply surviving another day. That's why the cream-colored envelope taped to his van's windshield hit him like a physical blow. Tom recognized the handwriting immediately, even though it had been 2 years since he'd seen it. Sarah's careful script, the letters perfectly formed the way she'd been taught in private school. Back when he could afford private school. Back when he'd been the kind of father who provided stability instead of embarrassment. His hands trembled as he peeled the tape away, and Scout, sensing his distress, pressed closer against his leg. The envelope was expensive paper, the kind used for important occasions, the kind used for weddings. Sarah Elizabeth Brennan and Michael James Chun request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony. The invitation read in elegant, gold lettering. The date was circled in Sarah's handwriting, October 15th. 3 weeks away. Tom sank onto the van's back bumper, the invitation heavy in his hands despite weighing almost nothing. Scout immediately jumped up beside him, his warm body a comforting presence against Tom's hip. The puppy had learned to read Tom's moods with uncanny accuracy, and right now, Tom's mood was somewhere between devastating grief and paralyzing panic. His daughter was getting married. His little girl, who used to climb on his shoulders to change. Light bulbs, who made him Father's Day cards with crooked letters and too much glue, who told him every secret and asked his advice about everything from homework to boys. She was getting married, and he'd almost missed it. The last time he'd seen Sarah, she was 24 years old and furious. She'd come to the apartment he'd rented after the divorce, the tiny place that smelled like other people's disappointments, and she'd looked at him with eyes full of disgust and pity. "You're drunk," she'd said, not even bothering to make it a question. "I'm fine," he'd replied, though they both knew it was a lie. He'd been drinking since noon, trying to numb the reality of his situation. The construction company had let him go the week before budget cuts, they'd said, though everyone knew it was because he'd been showing up late, showing up unprepared, showing up broken. "You're not fine, Dad. You haven't been fine since Mom left, and you're getting worse." "Your mother didn't leave," Tom had said, his words slurring despite his efforts to sound sober. "I drove her away. There's a difference. Stop feeling sorry." "For yourself," Sarah had snapped, and the anger in her voice had been worse than any physical blow. "Do something about it. Get help. Get sober. Be the father I remember instead of this." She gestured at his apartment, at him, at the empty bottles he'd tried to hide behind the couch. "Instead of this stranger wearing my dad's face." He'd tried to explain about the depression, about the weight that settled on his chest every morning and made simple tasks feel impossible. He'd tried to tell her about the shame that followed. Him like a shadow, whispering that he'd failed at everything that mattered: marriage, fatherhood, providing for his family. But the words had come out wrong, slurred, and self-pitying, and Sarah's expression had grown colder with every syllable. "Call me when you decide to get your life together," she'd said. And then she'd walked out of his apartment and, apparently, out of his life. That had been 2 years ago. 2 years of silence, of phone calls that went straight to voicemail, of birthday cards returned unopened. 2 years of wondering if his daughter was happy, if she was safe, if she ever thought about him at all. Now she was getting married, and somehow, miraculously, she'd still included him on the guest list. The invitation had found its way to him, through a forwarding chain that must have included his old landlord, his ex-wife's mother, and finally the post office box. He'd maintained even when he couldn't afford much else. Scout whined softly and nudged Tom's hand with his nose. The puppy's brown eyes held a concern that seemed almost human, as if he understood that this piece of paper represented something monumentally important. "She's getting married, Scout," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "My little girl is getting married, and look at me." He gestured at himself, the 3-day stubble, the clothes he'd worn for a week straight, the van that served as both home and symbol of how far he'd fallen. How could he show up at Sarah's wedding like this? How could he walk into a church full of her friends and her new family, looking like a homeless vagrant who'd wandered in from the street? But how could he not? Tom looked at the invitation again, studying every detail. The ceremony was at St. Mary's Cathedral, the same church where Sarah had been baptized as an infant. The reception was at the Phoenician resort, which meant Michael had money, good money. Sarah would want for nothing, which was both a relief and another reminder of Tom's failure as a provider. "I can't go like this," Tom said to Scout, who tilted his head as if considering the statement. "But I can't not go. She's my daughter." The puppy seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. He rested his head on Tom's knee and made a soft sound that wasn't quite a whine, more like an expression of sympathy. Tom's mind began to race. 3 weeks. He had 3 weeks to transform himself from a homeless, drunk living in his van into someone worthy of walking his daughter down the aisle. 3 weeks to become the father Sarah deserved. The father he'd once been before everything fell apart. He thought about his last bottle of whiskey, hidden beneath the van's spare tire. He'd been saving it for particularly bad nights, for times when the weight of his failures became too much to bear sober. Now he realized he couldn't afford any more bad nights. If he was going to make it to Sarah's wedding, if he was going to be the kind of father she could be proud of, the drinking had to stop completely. Scout sensed the shift in Tom's mood and sat up straighter, his tail giving a tentative wag. The puppy had learned to hope again in the weeks since his rescue, and now his hope seemed to extend to Tom's situation as well. "What do you think, boy?" Tom asked, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Think your old man can clean himself up in 3 weeks?" Scout's tail wagged harder, and Tom made his decision. He stood up, walked to the back of the van, and retrieved the bottle of whiskey from its hiding place. Without ceremony, he unscrewed the cap and poured the amber liquid onto the asphalt, watching it disappear into the cracks and crevices. Like all the other mistakes he'd made, Scout watched the process with interest, as if he understood that something important had just happened. "That's it," Tom said, tossing the empty bottle into a nearby dumpster. "No more excuses. No more feeling sorry for myself. If I'm going to be at that wedding, I'm going to be someone she can be proud of." He looked at the invitation one more time, memorizing every detail. October 15th, St. Mary's Cathedral. His daughter's wedding day, the date that would either mark his redemption or his final failure as a father. The alarm on Tom's cheap watch buzzed at 5:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past week. He'd found work with a construction crew, rebuilding a strip mall on the east side of Phoenix, and for the first time in months, he had a reason to get up before sunrise. Scout stirred beside him, the puppy's internal clock having adjusted to match Tom's new schedule. "Morning, boy," Tom whispered, careful not to wake any other early risers who might be sleeping in nearby vehicles. The industrial district was home to more people than the city liked to acknowledge, and everyone had their own methods of survival. Scout stretched and yawned, his pink tongue curling as he shook off sleep. In the weeks since his rescue, he'd grown from a skeletal, terrified creature into something approaching a normal puppy. His coat had developed a healthy shine, and his eyes held an alertness that spoke of regular meals and consistent care. Tom pulled on his work boots, the same Wolverines that had served him faithfully through 2 decades of construction jobs. The leather was scarred and stained, but the soles were still solid, and that's what mattered when you spent 10 hours on your feet. He'd learned to appreciate the things that lasted, the tools and possessions that could be counted on when everything else fell apart. "Stay here, Scout," Tom said, though he knew the command was unnecessary. The puppy had learned that the van was safety, that inside these metal walls, he was protected from the world that had once treated him so cruelly. "I'll be back tonight." Scout settled onto his blanket, a blue wool thing Tom had bought at a thrift store, and watched as Tom gathered his lunch and water bottle. The puppy's eyes held no anxiety now, no fear that Tom might not return. Trust, Tom had discovered, was something that could be rebuilt, even after it had been completely destroyed. The construction site was a 40-minute drive through Phoenix's awakening streets. Tom arrived 15 minutes early, as he had every day since starting the job. Punctuality was one of the few professional skills that poverty hadn't taken from him, and he guarded it jealously. Jake Morrison, the site foreman, was already there, clipboard in hand and coffee steaming in the morning air. Jake was younger than Tom by a decade, but he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. He nodded as Tom approached, a gesture that had evolved from suspicion to something approaching respect. "Over the past week." "Morning, Tom," Jake said. "How's that shoulder holding up?" Tom rotated his left shoulder experimentally. He'd pulled something on his third day, his body protesting the return to manual labor after months of inactivity. But he'd worked through the pain, partly from necessity and partly from the knowledge that showing weakness would likely cost him the job. "Good as new," Tom replied, which wasn't quite true, but was true enough for construction work. Jake nodded and consulted his clipboard. "I want you on the foundation work today. Martinez called in sick, and I need someone who knows what they're doing with concrete." Tom felt a surge of something he'd almost forgotten: professional pride. Jake was trusting him with important work, the kind that required experience and skill rather than just strong backs and willing hands. Foundation work was critical. Mistakes at this stage could compromise the entire structure. "You got it," Tom said, and meant it. The work was hard, exactly as Tom remembered. Mixing concrete, pouring it into forms, smoothing it with screeds and floats until the surface was level and ready for the next phase of construction. His muscles ached and his hands developed new calluses, but the pain felt clean somehow, honest in a way that sitting in the van drinking himself unconscious never had. During his lunch break, Tom found himself thinking about Scout waiting in the van. The puppy would be sleeping now, conserving energy for their evening walk. Tom had established a routine of taking Scout to a small park after work, where the puppy could run and play while Tom sat on a bench and planned for the next day. "You got kids?" asked Raymond, one of the younger workers who'd been making conversation during breaks. "A daughter," Tom replied without thinking, then felt a familiar stab of pain. "Haven't seen her in a while." Raymond nodded knowingly. Construction life, man. Hard on families. Tom didn't correct him, didn't explain that it hadn't been the work that drove his family away, but his inability to handle life when the work disappeared. Some truths were too complicated for lunch break conversations. "She getting married next month," Tom found himself saying, trying to get cleaned up for the wedding. "That's good, man," Raymond said. "Second chances, you know? Second chances." Tom liked the sound of that. He'd never thought of Sarah's wedding invitation as anything more than a painful reminder of his failures. But maybe Raymond was right. Maybe it was an opportunity to prove that he could be the father she deserved, even if it had taken him 2 years to figure out how. The afternoon passed quickly, and by the time Jake called an end to the workday, Tom's section of foundation was complete and properly finished. Jake walked over to inspect the work, running his hands along the smooth concrete surface and checking the level with a practiced eye. "Good work," Jake said simply, but Tom heard something more in those 2 words: respect, recognition, the acknowledgement that he was still capable of doing his job well. Driving back to the van, Tom allowed himself to feel something approaching optimism. He had 17 days until Sarah's wedding, and already he was making progress. He had steady work, he was staying sober, and he was saving money. Not much money. Construction wages weren't what they used to be, but enough to start thinking about buying decent clothes, maybe even renting a room somewhere. Scout was waiting when he returned, tail wagging with the pure joy that only dogs could muster for mundane homecomings. The puppy had learned to associate the sound of the van's engine with Tom's return, and his excitement was infectious. "Miss me, boy?" Tom asked, scratching behind Scout's ears in the spot that made his leg twitch with pleasure. They walked to the park as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded Tom why he'd moved to Arizona in the first place. Scout ran in wide circles, chasing scents and shadows with the boundless energy of youth, while Tom sat on their usual bench and counted the money in his wallet. $43. After gas and food, it wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had a week ago. At this rate, he might be able to afford a motel room for the night before the wedding, somewhere to shower and shave and transform himself into someone worthy of walking into a church. Scout returned from his explorations and settled beside Tom on the bench, panting happily. The puppy had developed the habit of checking in during their walks, as if making sure Tom was still there, still solid, still committed to their partnership. "We're gonna make it," Tom said softly, more to himself than to Scout. 17 days, and we're going to make it to that wedding." Scout's tail thumped against the bench, and Tom chose to interpret it as agreement. They sat together as darkness fell over the city, a man and his dog planning for a future that seemed, for the first time in months, actually possible. 2 weeks into his new routine, Tom received his first real paycheck in over 6 months. Jake handed him the envelope at the end of the workday, along with news that had Tom's heart racing with possibility. "Corporate's been watching the progress reports," Jake said, leaning against his pickup truck. "They're impressed with the quality of work coming out of this site. I told them it's because I finally got some experienced hands on the crew." Tom felt heat rise in his cheeks. Praise had become a foreign concept, something that belonged to his old life before everything had gone wrong. "I'm promoting you to crew leader," Jake continued. "Comes with a raise and some responsibility for training the newer guys. You interested?" Crew leader. Tom hadn't held a supervisory position since before the divorce, since before the drinking had made him unreliable. The words felt impossible, too good to be true. Yes," Tom managed. "Yes, I'm interested." Jake smiled and clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. Starts Monday. Don't make me regret this, Tom." "You won't," Tom said, and for the first time in years, he believed his own promise. The drive back to the van felt different somehow, charged with an energy Tom had forgotten he could feel. Scout sensed the change immediately, picking up on Tom's elevated mood the way he'd learned to read all of Tom's emotional states. "We did it, boy," Tom said, holding up the paycheck. "Not just any job, a good job, with a future." Scout's tail wagged so hard his entire body wiggled with excitement, though Tom suspected the puppy was responding more to his tone than to the actual words. Their first stop was a pet store Tom had been eyeing for weeks, a small family-owned place that stayed open late for working pet owners. Scout had been wearing a makeshift collar Tom had fashioned from rope and an old belt buckle, functional but hardly dignified for a dog who deserved better. "Help you find anything?" asked the elderly woman behind the counter. Her name tag read Dolores, and she had the patient, kindly expression of someone who'd spent her life caring for animals. "Looking for a collar," Tom said, suddenly self-conscious about his work clothes and general appearance. For him, Dolores looked down. Scout, who was sniffing cautiously at a display of dog toys, and her expression softened immediately. "He's beautiful," she said. "Golden retriever?" "Think so," Tom replied. "Found him a few weeks ago." He was someone had hurt him. Dolores' face darkened briefly. the way it did with people who understood that cruelty to animals was often a window into human darkness. But then she smiled and came around the counter to get a better look at Scout. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand for Scout to sniff. Scout approached cautiously, but allowed Dolores to pet him, his tail wagging tentatively. The puppy had learned to trust Tom completely, but new people still required careful evaluation. "He's learned to be careful," Dolores observed. "Smart boy. Let's find him something special." She led them to a wall display of collars ranging from basic nylon to elaborate leather creations studded with rhinestones. Tom's budget wouldn't stretch to the expensive options, but Dolores seemed to understand without being told. "This one," she said, selecting a simple leather collar in deep brown. "Good quality, comfortable, and it'll age well. Like a good pair of boots." Tom smiled at the comparison. "How much?" $12, Dolores said, then paused. "But since he's a rescue, let's call it 10. Scout stood patiently while Dolores fitted the collar, adjusting it so it was snug but not tight. The leather looked handsome against his golden coat, dignified in a way that made Tom's chest swell with pride. "Now he looks like the gentleman he was meant to be," Dolores said approvingly. Tom paid for the collar and, on impulse, added a simple rope toy to the purchase. Scout had been making do with sticks and empty bottles, and every dog deserved at least one real toy. "He's lucky to have found you," Dolores said as she rang up the sale. "Other way around," Tom replied quietly. Outside the store, Scout seemed to sense that something significant had happened. He held his head higher, as if aware that the new collar marked a transition from rescued stray to beloved companion. Tom clipped a basic leash to the collar's D-ring, and they walked to the small park where they spent their evenings. "Sit," Tom said, holding up his hand in the universal stop gesture. Scout had been learning basic commands through repetition and gentle correction, but his response was still inconsistent. Tonight, however, he sat immediately, his attention focused entirely on Tom. "Good boy," Tom said, producing the rope toy. "Want to play?" The next hour passed in a blur of running, fetching, and the kind of uncomplicated joy that Tom had forgotten was possible. Scout took to the rope toy with enthusiasm, shaking it vigorously before returning it for another throw. Other dog owners in the park smiled at Scout's antics, and a few stopped to comment on what a beautiful, well-behaved dog he was. "He's a rescue," Tom found himself saying with pride. "Someone had abandoned him, but we found each other." As the sun set, Tom and Scout settled on their usual bench. The puppy was pleasantly tired from play, content to rest his head on Tom's knee while Tom counted his money again. The promotion would mean an extra $150 a week, not a fortune, but enough to start thinking about real improvements to their situation. Tom pulled out his phone, a cheap prepaid model he'd bought when he still had hopes of finding steady work. Sarah's number was still programmed into it, though he hadn't had the courage to call in months. Tonight, buoyed by his success and the gentle pressure of Scout's presence, he found himself dialing before he could lose his nerve. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Sarah's voice sounded older than he remembered, more professional. "Hi, you've reached Sarah. Please leave a message and I'll get back to you." Tom's throat felt tight as he waited for the beep. What could he say? How could he summarize 2 years of silence and failure in the space of a voicemail message? "Hi, honey," he said finally. "It's Dad. I know it's been a while, but I wanted you to know that I'm doing better. I've got a job now, and He paused, looking down at Scout. "I'm trying to get my life back together. I got your wedding invitation, and I'd really like to be there if that's okay with you. I love you, Sarah. I hope you're happy." He ended the call before he could second-guess himself and sat staring at the phone, wondering if he'd just made things better or worse. Scout sensed his mood change and pressed closer against his leg, offering the wordless comfort that had become his specialty. The puppy didn't judge or question. He simply provided presence and warmth when they were needed most. "Think she'll call back?" Tom asked. Scout's tail thumped once against the bench, which Tom chose to interpret as optimism. They sat together as the park emptied and the streetlights flickered on. Tom's phone remained silent, but for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like possibility, like the space between question and answer where hope could live. 13 days until the wedding. 13 days to prove that he could be the father Sarah deserved. Tom looked down at Scout, now wearing his new collar like a badge of belonging, and allowed himself to believe it might actually be possible. The motel room was nothing special thin. Carpeting, a window that faced the parking lot, and a bathroom that had seen better decades. But to Tom, it felt like luxury. After weeks of sleeping in the van, the simple pleasure of a real bed and running water was almost overwhelming. Scout approached the room cautiously, his nose working overtime to process all the new scents. He'd never been inside a building other than the veterinary clinic, and his hesitancy was understandable. The puppy stayed close to Tom's legs as they explored their temporary home. "What do you think, boy?" Tom asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm but comfortable, a vast improvement over his makeshift sleeping arrangement in the van. Scout jumped up beside him, testing the unfamiliar softness before settling against Tom's hip. His tail wagged tentatively, as if he was willing to approve of this new development but wanted to reserve final judgment. The room had cost Tom $60 for the week, money he could barely afford, but desperately needed to spend. Dr. Elena Martinez had mentioned it during Scout's latest checkup, suggesting that stable housing might help both of them sleep better. She'd been right, though Tom suspected her concern extended beyond their sleep schedules. Dr. Martinez had become more than just Scout's veterinarian over the past month. She'd proven to be one of those rare people who offered help without judgment, who saw past surface circumstances to the effort underneath. When Tom had mentioned his daughter's wedding, Dr. Martinez had insisted on giving Scout a thorough examination and grooming session at no charge. "Every father should be proud when he walks his daughter down the aisle," she'd said, brushing Scout's coat until it gleamed. "And every daughter should see that her father has companions who love him." Tom had been touched by her kindness, though he'd been careful not to reveal too much about his situation. He'd learned that even well-meaning people could become uncomfortable when they realized just how precarious his circumstances were. His new role as crew leader had changed things at work, too. The other men looked to him for guidance now, asked his opinion on technical problems, deferred to his experience in ways that reminded Tom who he used to be. Yesterday, Jake had pulled him aside to discuss long-term plans for the project, speaking as if Tom's continued employment was a given rather than a daily uncertainty. "Corporate's talking about starting another project when this one wraps up," Jake had said. "Bigger job, more complex. I told him I want to keep my best people." Best people. Tom rolled the phrase around in his mind as he watched Scout explore the motel room. When had he started thinking of himself as capable again? When had hope crept back into his daily calculations? The answer was sitting beside him, methodically grooming his golden fur with the concentrated attention that dogs brought to personal hygiene. Scout had given him a reason to get up each morning, a purpose beyond his own survival. The puppy's dependence had forced Tom to become dependable again, one small step at a time. Tom's phone buzzed, startling both of them. Scout's ears perked up as Tom fumbled for the device, his heart racing when he saw Sarah's name on the screen. "Hello?" He answered, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was cautious, uncertain. "I got your message." Sarah. Tom closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the simple pleasure of hearing his daughter's voice. "Thank you for calling back. You said you got a job. Construction work. I'm a crew leader now. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and he hoped she could hear it. There was a long pause before Sarah spoke again. That's good, Dad. I'm glad you're working. I want to come to your wedding, Tom said quickly, before his courage could fail him. If that's okay with you. I know I let you down, but I'm trying to do better. Another pause, longer this time. Scout seemed to sense the importance of the conversation and moved closer, pressing his warm body against Tom's side. Where are you living? Sarah asked finally. Tom looked around the modest motel room, then down at Scout. The truth felt too complicated, too fragile to share over the phone. I've got a place, he said, which was technically accurate. It's not much, but it's mine. I've got a dog now. His name is Scout. A dog? For the first time, Sarah's voice held something other than wariness. Since when do you have a dog? Since I found him abandoned and decided we needed each other. Tom scratched behind Scout's ears, earning a contented sigh. He's a good boy. Golden retriever, about 4 months old now. Dad, you can barely take care of yourself. I'm taking care of both of us, Tom interrupted gently. Every day. That's what I'm trying to tell you, Sarah. I'm different now. Better. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Could almost see her struggling with the decision to trust him again. The wedding is at 2 o'clock, she said finally. At St. Mary's. I know. I have the invitation. If you come, Sarah's voice became firm, the tone she'd inherited from her mother. If you come, you need to be sober, completely sober. And you need to look like someone who should be walking me down the aisle. I will be, Tom promised. I am sober, Sarah. It's been over a month now. A month isn't very long, Dad. No, Tom agreed. But it's a start. And every day gets a little easier. Scout chose that moment to yawn and stretch, his claws clicking against the phone. Sarah must have heard the sound because she asked, Is that him? The dog? That's Scout. Say hello, boy. Scout tilted his head at the sound of Tom's voice, then made a small woofing sound that wasn't quite a bark. To Tom's amazement, Sarah laughed. It was a brief sound, quickly stifled, but it was genuine. He sounds sweet, she said. He is. He saved my life, Sarah. I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. Finding him gave me a reason to get up each morning, a reason to try again. The silence stretched between them, filled with 2 years of hurt and disappointment, and the tentative possibility of forgiveness. I want to believe you, Sarah said quietly. I want to believe that you're getting better. Then let me prove it. Tom said, Let me walk you down the aisle. Let me be your father again. You never stop being my father, Sarah replied, and Tom heard tears in her voice. You just stopped being the father I remembered. Tom felt his own eyes fill with tears. Scout seemed to sense his emotion and rested his head on Tom's knee, offering silent comfort. I'm trying to find him again, Tom said. The father you remembered. Scout's helping me remember who I used to be. Bring him, Sarah said suddenly. To the wedding. Bring Scout. Sarah, I don't think dogs are allowed in church. I'll talk to Father Miguel. If Scout helped save your life, then he's part of our family now. Besides, I want to meet him. Tom's throat felt tight with gratitude. Are you sure? I'm sure. But Dad, her voice became serious again. This is your one chance. If you show up drunk, if you embarrass me or Michael or our families, that's it. I won't give you another opportunity to hurt me. You won't have to, Tom promised. I'll be there, and I'll be the father you deserve. After they said goodbye, Tom sat holding the phone, hardly daring to believe what had just happened. Scout seemed to understand that something momentous had occurred, and he pressed closer against Tom's side. She wants to meet you, Tom told Scout, who responded by licking Tom's hand with his warm, rough tongue. We're going to a wedding, boy. A real wedding. 9 days. Tom looked around the motel room, already planning. He needed decent clothes, a proper haircut, maybe even a tie. Scout would need a bath and brushing to look his best for meeting Sarah. For the first time in 2 years, Tom allowed himself to imagine walking his daughter down the aisle. He pictured Sarah in her wedding dress, beautiful and radiant, her arm linked through his as they walked toward her future. He imagined Scout waiting patiently at the altar, well-behaved and dignified, a living symbol of Tom's transformation. From broken man to devoted father. It was going to happen. Against all odds, despite all his failures, he was going to be there for the most important day of his daughter's life. And Scout was going to be right there beside him. Tom had carried the photograph in his wallet for 15 years, though he rarely looked at it anymore. The edges were worn soft from handling, the colors faded from age, and the occasional splash of water when his wallet had gotten wet during the worst of his homeless days. It showed Sarah at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning at the camera on her first day of 3rd grade, her hair in pigtails that Linda had spent 20 minutes perfecting. He pulled the photo out now, sitting on the motel room bed while Scout napped beside him. The image was barely recognizable. Water damage had blurred Sarah's features and given the whole picture a dreamlike quality that seemed appropriate somehow. This was how his memories felt now, precious but indistinct, like looking at his past life through frosted glass. "That's your big sister," Tom said softly to Scout, who opened one eye to look at the photograph with polite interest. She was the smartest kid in her class, maybe the smartest kid in the whole school. Used to read me bedtime stories when she was old enough. Can you believe that? Reversal of roles. Scout stretched and moved closer, sensing that Tom needed the comfort of companionship. The puppy had developed an uncanny ability to read Tom's moods, offering presence during the difficult moments and playful distraction when the memories became too heavy. Tom's phone sat silent on the nightstand. Sarah had called 3 days ago to confirm that he was still planning to attend the wedding, and their conversation had been cautiously optimistic. She'd even laughed when Tom described Scout's habit of stealing socks from the laundry basket he'd bought for their motel room. But underneath her tentative warmth, Tom could hear the wariness that 2 years of disappointment had carved into her voice. He couldn't blame her for being careful. He'd made promises before, promised to get help, promised to stay sober, promised to be the father she deserved. Each broken promise had damaged their relationship a little more, until finally Sarah had stopped believing that change was possible. But this time was different. Tom felt it in his bones, in the way he woke each morning without the crushing weight of despair, in the way he looked forward to each day's work instead of simply enduring it. Scout had given him something to live for beyond his own survival, and that had made all the difference. The puppy was proof of Tom's transformation. 4 weeks ago, Scout had been a broken, terrified creature who flinched at sudden movements and hoarded food as if every meal might be his last. Now he was confident and playful, secure in the knowledge that Tom would provide for him and protect him from harm. If Tom could help Scout heal from abandonment and abuse, maybe he really could rebuild his relationship with Sarah. "We need to look our best for the wedding," Tom told Scout, who thumped his tail in response. "That means a bath for you and a haircut for me. Think you can handle being handsome for one day?" Scout's response was to roll onto his back, exposing his belly for scratching, a gesture of complete trust that never failed to move Tom. He obliged, rubbing Scout's soft fur while planning their preparation for the wedding he'd already purchased. A suit from a thrift store downtown, a navy blue ensemble that fit reasonably well after some minor alterations. The shirt was crisp white cotton, and he'd found a tie that complemented the suit without being too flashy. It was the kind of outfit he used to wear to company Christmas parties, back when he'd had a company to work for and a family to accompany him. Dr. Martinez had offered to groom Scout professionally as a wedding gift. and Tom had accepted gratefully. The veterinarian had become one of his strongest supporters, never asking invasive questions about his living situation, but always making herself available when he needed advice or encouragement. "Every father deserves to walk his daughter down the aisle with dignity," she'd said when Tom tried to decline her generosity. "And every dog deserves to look magnificent when meeting his new family." Tom had been practicing what he would say to Sarah when he saw her. Not the awkward small talk of their phone conversations, but the real words, the important ones that he'd been carrying in his heart for 2 years. He wanted to tell her how proud he was of the woman she'd become, how sorry he was for the pain he'd caused, how grateful he was for this second chance. But every time he rehearsed the words, they felt inadequate. How could language capture the depth of his regret, the completeness of his love, the desperate hope that they could rebuild what had been broken? Some emotions were too large for words, too complicated for simple apologies. Scout seemed to sense his inner turmoil and pressed closer, offering the wordless comfort that had become his greatest gift. The puppy didn't need explanations or justifications. He loved completely and without reservation, accepting Tom exactly as he was while somehow inspiring him to become better. "You're going to charm everyone at that wedding," Tom said, scratching behind Scout's ears. "Just like you charmed me in that alley. Just like you've been charming everyone we meet." It was true. Scout had a gift for bringing out the best in people. The construction crew had adopted him as their unofficial mascot during the times Tom brought into the job site. Dr. Martinez lit up whenever she saw him. Even the gruff motel manager had started slipping Scout treats when he thought Tom wasn't looking. Maybe that's what Tom needed. Not perfect words or elaborate gestures, but the simple honesty that Scout embodied every day. The puppy didn't try to hide his past trauma or pretend to be something he wasn't. He simply offered his authentic self, trusting that love would be enough. 6 days until the wedding. Tom looked at the faded photograph one more time, then carefully tucked it back into his wallet. Soon he would see Sarah in person, would watch her walk down the aisle toward her new life. He would be there not because he deserved to be, but because she had chosen to forgive him, to give him one more chance to be the father she remembered. And Scout would be there too, living proof that broken things could heal, that abandoned hearts could learn to trust again, that love really could triumph over the worst that life had to offer. Tom closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine the moment when Sarah would meet Scout for the first time. He pictured her kneeling down to let the puppy sniff her hand, pictured Scout's tail wagging with enthusiasm as he accepted another member into their small pack. He imagined Sarah looking up at him with something approaching the trust she'd once given so freely, seeing in Scout's devotion a reflection of the man Tom was working so hard to become. It was going to be perfect. It had to be. The eviction notice was taped to Tom's motel room door when he returned from work on Thursday evening, 4 days before Sarah's wedding. The official letterhead of Phoenix Development Corporation seemed to mock him as he read the terms. All residents had 7 days to vacate the premises due to scheduled demolition for a new shopping complex. Scout sensed Tom's distress immediately and pressed against his legs as Tom read the notice a second time, hoping the words would somehow change. They didn't. The motel that had become their sanctuary, their stepping stone back to respectability, was being torn down to make room for progress. 7 days, Tom said aloud, his voice hollow with disbelief. "They're giving us 7 days." Scout whined softly and looked up at Tom with concerned brown eyes. The puppy had learned to associate changes in Tom's tone with potential danger, a survival instinct carved deep by his early experiences of abandonment. Tom sank onto the motel room bed, the eviction notice crumpling in his trembling hands. All his careful planning, all his progress toward stability, threatened to collapse in an instant. Where would they go? The van was still functional, But returning to life on the streets felt like admitting defeat, like proving that he wasn't really capable of the transformation he'd claimed. And Sarah's wedding was in 4 days. The irony was bitter. Just when Tom had begun to believe in his own redemption, just when he'd started to envision a future that included regular contact with his daughter, the ground was shifting beneath his feet again. How could he walk Sarah down the aisle knowing that immediately afterward he'd be homeless again? Scout jumped onto the bed beside him, and Tom gathered the puppy close, drawing comfort from his warm, solid presence. At least they would face this crisis together. Whatever happened, Tom wouldn't abandon Scout the way he'd been abandoned. That much he could control. His phone rang, startling both of them. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and Tom answered. With reluctance, not ready to share this latest catastrophe with anyone. Tom, you sound terrible, Jake said without preamble. Everything okay? Just tired, Tom lied, then immediately regretted it. Jake had been nothing but supportive, and honesty had served Tom better than deception in recent weeks. Actually, no, Tom corrected himself. I'm being evicted from my motel. The whole place is being demolished. Jesus, that's rough timing. When do you have to be out? 7 days. Right after my daughter's wedding. Jake was quiet for a moment, and Tom could hear the sounds of his family in the background, children laughing, television playing, the comfortable chaos of a home filled with people who belong to each other. Look, I've got a spare room in my basement, Jake said finally. It's not much, but it's clean and private. You and Scout could stay there while you figure out something permanent. Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion. Jake's offer was generous, beyond measure, but accepting it meant admitting how precarious his situation really was. It meant acknowledging that despite weeks of steady work and careful saving, he was still one crisis away from complete collapse. I can't ask you to do that, Tom said. You're not asking. I'm offering. Besides, Linda's been after me to rent that room out for extra income. You'd actually be doing me a favor. Scout seemed to sense the importance of the conversation and moved closer, resting his head on Tom's lap. The puppy's presence was steadying, a reminder that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was what families did for each other. How much rent? Tom asked, his practical side asserting itself. We'll figure that out later. Right now, you need a place to stay, and I need someone I trust living in my house while I'm traveling for work next month. Tom closed his eyes, overwhelmed by Jake's kindness. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you'll bring Scout by this weekend so he can meet our kids. They've been asking about the famous golden retriever from the job site. After they hung up, Tom sat staring at the eviction notice, but its power to devastate him had diminished. Scout stretched out beside him, completely relaxed now that Tom's anxiety had subsided. The puppy had learned to trust that Tom would solve their problems, would find a way forward no matter how impossible the situation seemed. Maybe that was the real lesson of their partnership. Not that love could prevent crises from happening, but that love could provide the strength to weather them when they did. Tom had spent 2 years running from his problems, drowning them in alcohol, avoiding the hard work of rebuilding. But Scout had taught him a different way facing challenges head-on, accepting help when it was offered, trusting that tomorrow might be better than today. Tom's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Martinez. How's the pre-wedding preparation going? Scout ready for his big debut? Instead of pretending everything was fine, Tom found himself typing the truth. Eviction notice today. Jake offered us a room. Scared but grateful. Her response came quickly. Crisis and blessing often arrive together. Scout picked the right human to save. See you Saturday for grooming. Tom smiled despite his circumstances. Dr. Martinez had a gift for perspective, for finding hope in situations that seemed hopeless. She was right. If Scout hadn't needed rescuing, Tom might never have found the motivation to change his life. If the motel wasn't being demolished, he might never have discovered that people like Jake existed, ready to offer help without judgment. "You know what, boy?" Tom said to Scout, who opened one eye to acknowledge being addressed. "Maybe this isn't the end of our progress. Maybe it's the beginning of something better." Scout's tail thumped once against the bedspread, and Tom chose to interpret it as agreement. 3 days until Sarah's wedding. 3 days to pack their meager possessions, transition to Jake's house, and somehow maintain the confidence that had carried Tom this far. It wouldn't be easy, but he'd learned that the most worthwhile things never were. Tom looked around the modest motel room that had been their first real home together. Soon they would leave this place, but they wouldn't be leaving empty-handed. They had each other. They had Jake's friendship. They had Dr. Martinez's support. And most importantly, they had Sarah's tentative willingness to trust again. The eviction notice was still a crisis, but it was no longer a catastrophe. Tom folded the paper carefully and placed it in his wallet, next to Sarah's faded photograph. Evidence of where they'd been, not a prediction of where they were going. Scout stretched and yawned, completely unconcerned about their housing situation. His faith in Tom was absolute, unshakable by circumstances or setbacks. In the puppy's worldview, as long as they were together, everything else was just details to be worked out. Tom envied that confidence, and he was determined to prove it was justified. The morning of Sarah's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect Arizona sky that made postcards look understated. Tom had been awake since 4 a.m., his nervous energy making sleep impossible despite Scout's warm presence beside him in Jake's guest room. The puppy sensed the importance of the day and had been unusually attentive, following Tom's every movement with alert brown eyes. Tom's wedding speech notes lay scattered across the small desk Jake had provided, pages covered with crossed-out words and tear stains from the emotional rehearsals he'd conducted in private. He'd written and rewritten the speech a dozen times, struggling to find words that could bridge 2 years of silence and hurt. How do you apologize for becoming a stranger to your own child? How do you express gratitude for forgiveness you're not sure you deserve? "Morning, boy," Tom whispered, careful not to wake Jake's family. Scout's tail thumped softly against the blanket, and he stretched before patting over to rest his head on Tom's knee. The bathroom mirror reflected a man Tom barely recognized. The months of steady work had filled out his face, erasing the gaunt hollows that had made him look older than his years. His hair, freshly cut by a barber who'd listened patiently to Tom's explanation of why this particular haircut mattered so much, was neat and professional. The man in the mirror looked capable, responsible, like someone who might actually deserve to walk his daughter down the aisle. Dr. Martinez would arrive in an hour to pick up Scout for his grooming appointment. She'd insisted on handling every detail of Scout's preparation, from bathing to brushing to fitting him with a special collar she'd ordered for the occasion. "Every member of the wedding party deserves to look his best," she'd said with the kind of smile that made Tom believe in guardian angels. Tom's navy suit hung on the closet door, pressed and ready. He'd tried it on 3 times the night before, adjusting the tie and checking his appearance from every angle. The suit was secondhand, but dignified, the kind of outfit that suggested respectability without calling attention to itself. Exactly what a father should wear to his daughter's wedding. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, are you awake?" "I couldn't sleep." Tom's heart raced as he typed back. "Wide awake. You okay?" "Nervous, excited, scared, all at once." "Is that normal?" Tom smiled, remembering his own wedding day 30 years ago, the mixture of joy and terror that had made his hand shake as he waited at the altar for Linda to walk down the aisle. "Completely normal. Your mom felt the same way on our wedding day. You remember that?" "I remember everything about that day. Best day of my life until you were born." There was a long pause before Sarah's next message. "I'm glad you're going to be there today, Dad. Really glad." Tom's eyes filled with tears as he typed, "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Scout seemed to understand the emotional significance of the text exchange and pressed closer against Tom's legs. The puppy had learned to provide comfort during Tom's vulnerable moments, offering the kind of unconditional support that humans often struggled to give each other. Jake appeared in the doorway, already dressed for work despite the early hour. "Big day," he said quietly, nodding toward Tom's wedding attire. "Biggest day in 2 years," Tom replied. "Thanks again for letting us stay here, Jake. I know it's not permanent, but it means everything right now." "Take as long as you need," Jake said. "Besides, my kids are already planning to kidnap Scout if you try to move out too soon." The thought of Jake's children falling in love with Scout brought a smile to Tom's face. Last night, he'd watched 8-year-old Emma teach Scout to shake hands while 6-year-old Tyler tried to convince the puppy to wear a superhero cape. Scout had endured both activities with patient good humor, his tail wagging constantly at the attention. "He's good with kids," Tom observed. "Natural therapy dog," Jake agreed. "You ever think about getting him certified? There's a program at the Children's Hospital where volunteers bring their dogs to visit patients." Tom looked down at Scout, who was now sitting perfectly at attention, as if auditioning for the role. The idea had merit. Scout's gentle nature and intuitive empathy would make him perfect for comfort work. It would also give Tom a way to give back, to turn their story of rescue and redemption into something that could help others. "After we get through today," Tom said, "one milestone at a time." Dr. Martinez arrived precisely at 8 a.m., her van equipped with a portable grooming station that would transform Scout from handsome pet to wedding-ready gentleman. Scout greeted her with enthusiasm, his trust in the veterinarian absolute after months of gentle care. "Ready for your big day, Scout?" Dr. Martinez asked, scratching behind his ears in the spot that made his leg twitch with pleasure. Scout's response was to press against her legs and wag, his tail so hard his entire body wiggled with excitement. His confidence had grown enormously since those early days when he'd flinched at every touch, and now he approached new experiences with curiosity rather than fear. "We'll have him back here by noon," Dr. Martinez told Tom. "Bathed, brushed, and wearing his new collar. He's going to be the most handsome dog at St. Mary's Cathedral." After they left, Tom found himself alone with his thoughts and his increasingly elaborate anxiety. He paced the small room, rehearsing his speech under his breath, checking and rechecking the wedding timeline Sarah had sent him. The ceremony was at 2 p.m., which meant he needed to be at the church by 1:30 for photographs. The reception would begin at 4, and he was expected to give his father of the bride speech during dinner. He pulled out his phone and called Dr. Martinez, even though she was probably busy with Scout's grooming. "Tom?" She answered on the second ring. "Everything okay?" "I'm terrified," Tom admitted. "What if I mess this up? What if I say the wrong thing? Or Scout misbehaves? Or Sarah realizes she made a mistake inviting me?" "Tom," Dr. Martinez said gently, "you've been preparing for this day for months. Not just the wedding, but becoming the kind of man who deserves to be there. Scout knows how important this is. He'll be perfect. And Sarah invited you because she loves you, not because she expects you to be perfect." "But what if you trust yourself the way Scout trusts you?" Dr. Martinez interrupted. "What if you believe you're worthy of this moment the way he believes you're worthy of his love?" Tom looked at himself in the mirror again, seeing not the broken man who'd found a puppy behind a dumpster, but the father who'd rebuilt his life one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. "You're right," he said. "I can do this." "You can do this," Dr. Martinez agreed. "And Scout will be right there beside you, reminding everyone who sees you together that miracles happen every day." After the call ended, Tom sat on the bed and closed his eyes, centering himself the way he'd learned to do during the most difficult days of his recovery. He thought about the night he'd found Scout, about the desperate puppy who'd given up hope until a stranger knelt beside him in the rain. He thought about their journey together, the gradual building of trust and love that had saved them both. Today wasn't just about Sarah's wedding. It was about proving that broken things could heal, that abandoned hearts could learn to trust again, that love really could triumph over the worst that life had to offer. Tom and Scout were living proof of those possibilities, and their presence at the wedding would be a testament to the power of second chances. Tom opened his eyes and began getting dressed. In 6 hours, he would walk his daughter down the aisle. Scout would be there beside him, dignified and beautiful, a living symbol of the transformation that had brought them to this moment. They were ready. St. Mary's Cathedral stood magnificent against the afternoon sky, its twin spires reaching toward heaven like prayers made manifest in stone. Tom pulled into the parking lot with 20 minutes to spare, his hands steady on the steering wheel, despite the emotions churning in his chest. Scout sat in the passenger seat, transformed by Dr. Martinez's expert grooming into the most beautiful dog Tom had ever seen. The puppy's golden coat gleamed like spun sunshine, every hair brushed to perfection. His new collar was genuine leather, deep brown with brass fittings, and engraved on the nameplate in elegant script were the words Scout Brennan and Tom's phone number. But it was the small white rose corsage pinned to his collar that made Tom's throat tight with emotion. Dr. Martinez's final touch, ensuring that Scout would be properly dressed for his role in the wedding party. "You ready for this, boy?" Tom asked, adjusting his tie one final time in the rearview mirror. Scout's response was to sit up straighter, his chest puffed out with pride, as if he understood the importance of looking his best. The months of gentle training had paid off. Scout knew how to walk properly on a leash, how to sit and stay on command, how to greet new people with polite enthusiasm rather than overwhelming excitement. The church parking lot was filling with wedding guests, and Tom watched through his windshield as Sarah's friends and family made their way toward the cathedral entrance. He recognized some faces from happier times. Linda's sister Margaret, who'd sent him birthday cards every year even after the divorce. Sarah's college roommate Jennifer, who'd always called him Mr. B with genuine affection. Old family friends who'd known Sarah since she was small. Tom's ex-wife Linda emerged from a silver sedan, and Tom's breath caught in his throat. She looked older, more distinguished, her graying hair styled elegantly, and her dress the kind of understated navy that suggested good taste and financial stability. Behind her walked a man Tom didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, wearing a well-tailored charcoal suit. Linda's companion, presumably, though Tom felt no jealousy at the realization that she'd moved on. If anything, he was glad she'd found someone who could give her the stability he'd failed to provide. Scout noticed Tom's tension and pressed against his arm, offering the wordless comfort that had become his specialty. The puppy's presence was steadying, a reminder that Tom belonged here not because of who he used to be, but because of who he'd become. "Come on," Tom said, clipping Scout's leash to his collar. "Let's go meet your new family." The walk from the car to the cathedral entrance felt both endless and instantaneous. Other guests smiled at Scout, and Tom heard murmurs of appreciation for the beautiful dog and his obvious good behavior. Scout walked beside Tom with perfect heel alignment, his head up and tail wagging, gently confident but not overeager. Exactly as Tom had hoped, Father Miguel, the elderly priest who'd baptized Sarah as an infant, waited at the cathedral doors with a warm smile. "Thomas," he said, extending his hand. "It's wonderful to see you again. And this must be the famous Scout I've heard so much about." Scout sat automatically when they stopped, waiting politely to be introduced. Father Miguel knelt down with surprising agility for a man in his 70s and offered his hand for Scout to sniff. "Sarah told me about your companion," Father Miguel said as Scout accepted his gentle pats with dignified pleasure. "She said he helped save your life." Animals are God's messengers sometimes, don't you think? I think Scout might be the closest thing to an angel I've ever met, Tom replied honestly. Then he's welcome in God's house, Father Miguel said, rising and adjusting his vestments. Sarah's in the bride's room with her mother and the other. Ladies, she asked me to tell you she'll see you in a few minutes for photographs. Tom's heart hammered as he led Scout into the cathedral's cool interior. The church was decorated with white roses and baby's breath, elegant in its simplicity, and afternoon sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows in jeweled patterns across the stone floor. This was where Sarah had taken her first communion, where she'd been confirmed as a teenager, where she probably dreamed of her wedding day long before she met Michael. Michael appeared from a side door, resplendent in his black tuxedo, his face glowing with the particular happiness of grooms on their wedding day. He was handsome in an earnest, academic way, exactly the kind of man Tom had hoped Sarah would find. Someone steady and kind, someone who would treasure her the way she deserved to be treasured. Mr. Brennan, Michael said, approaching with his hand extended. I'm so glad you could be here today. Tom shook his future son-in-law's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of good character. Wouldn't miss it for the world. This is Scout. Michael knelt immediately to greet Scout, who responded with gentle enthusiasm, his tail wagging as he accepted pats and kind words. Sarah's told me all about him, Michael said. She said he helped you find your way back to your family. He did, Tom said simply. He really did. Dad? Sarah's voice came from behind him, and Tom turned to see his daughter for the first time in 2 years. She was breathtaking. The wedding dress was simple but elegant, ivory silk that complemented her olive complexion and dark hair. But it wasn't the dress that made Tom's eyes fill with tears. It was the radiant happiness on Sarah's face, the way she glowed with joy and love, and the particular beauty that comes from being completely certain you're making the right choice. Sarah, Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She approached cautiously, as if still not quite believing he was really there, really sober, really the father she remembered from before everything went wrong. Scout sensed the importance of the moment and sat perfectly still, his intuitive understanding of human emotion on full display. You look, Sarah's voice caught. You look like my dad again. Tom opened his arms tentatively, afraid to presume, afraid to push too hard after so many months of careful rebuilding. Sarah stepped into his embrace without hesitation, and for a moment they stood together in the cathedral's hushed atmosphere, father and daughter, holding each other as if they could make up for 2 years of separation in a single hug. I'm so proud of you, Tom whispered into her hair. So proud of the woman you've become. I'm proud of you too, Sarah replied, and the words hit Tom with more force than any blessing he'd ever received. When they separated, Sarah looked down at Scout, who had remained perfectly patient throughout their reunion. And you must be Scout, she said, kneeling carefully in her wedding dress. Scout approached her with the same gentle dignity he'd shown Father Miguel and Michael, allowing Sarah to pet him and examine his corsage with obvious delight. His tail wagged steadily, but not frantically. He seemed to understand that this was a formal occasion requiring his best behavior. His beautiful dad, Sarah said, looking up at Tom with something that might have been wonder. Dr. Martinez was right. He does look like he was born to be part of a wedding party. He saved my life, Sarah, Tom said quietly. Finding him, taking care of him, it gave me a reason to get up every morning, a reason to try again. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back quickly. No crying yet, she said firmly. We haven't even started the ceremony. Linda appeared in the cathedral doorway, elegant and composed as always, though Tom caught a flicker of surprise when she saw him. 2 years of hard living had aged him, but the months of sobriety and steady work had restored something essential. He looked like himself again, like the man she'd married all those years ago. "Hello, Tom," Linda said carefully. "Linda, you look beautiful." And she did, poised and confident in a way that made Tom genuinely happy for her. "Thank you." Her eyes moved to Scout, taking in his perfect grooming and dignified posture. This must be Scout. Scout seemed to sense that Linda was important and offered his most polite greeting, sitting perfectly and offering his paw when she extended her hand. Linda smiled despite herself, charmed by his obvious good manners. "Sarah told me about him," Linda said. "About how he helped you." She paused, seeming to search for the right words. "About how he helped you find your way back." "He did," Tom said simply. "Every day." The wedding photographer appeared, all business and professional efficiency, and began organizing family photographs. Tom found himself standing beside Sarah, Scout sitting perfectly at his feet, while the camera captured images that would preserve this moment forever. The formal portraits, the candid shots of Sarah laughing at something Michael whispered in her ear, the picture of Scout looking directly at the camera with his intelligent brown eyes. Each click of the shutter felt like evidence that this day was really happening, that Tom was really here, really part of his daughter's wedding day. "Places, everyone," Father Miguel announced. "It's time to begin." Sarah took Tom's arm, her hand trembling slightly with excitement and nerves. Scout fell into perfect heel position beside Tom, the months of training evident in his precise movements and calm demeanor. "Ready?" Tom asked his daughter. "Ready," Sarah replied, squeezing his arm gently. The organ music swelled, filling the cathedral with the traditional wedding march that had announced countless brides over the decades. Tom looked down the aisle toward the altar where Michael waited, his face radiant with love and anticipation. Friends and family rose from their seats, turning to watch Sarah's entrance, cameras ready to capture every moment. This was it, the moment Tom had been working toward for months, the chance to walk his daughter down the aisle and give her away to the man who would love and cherish her for the rest of her life. Scout would be right there beside them, living proof that broken things could heal, that abandoned hearts could learn to trust again, that love really could triumph over the worst that life had to offer. The walk down the aisle felt like a journey through time itself. With each step, Tom could feel the weight of the past 2 years lifting from his shoulders, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten how to feel: pure, uncomplicated joy. Sarah's hand rested lightly on his arm, her steps perfectly measured to match his pace, while Scout walked beside them with the dignity of a dog who understood his importance to this moment. The cathedral was filled to capacity, every pew occupied by people who'd come to celebrate Sarah and Michael's union. Tom recognized faces from Sarah's childhood teachers, neighbors, family friends who'd watched her grow from a gap-toothed 8-year-old into the radiant woman beside him. Their eyes held warmth and acceptance, not the judgment Tom had feared. Whatever mistakes he'd made, whatever pain he'd caused, today was about new beginnings and second chances. Halfway down the aisle, Tom caught sight of Dr. Martinez sitting near the back, her face glowing with maternal pride as she watched Scout's perfect performance. She gave Tom a subtle thumbs up, and he felt his confidence soar even higher. Jake was there too, sitting with his wife and children, Emma and Tyler waving enthusiastically at Scout until their mother gently reminded them about church behavior. Michael waited at the altar, his face shining with such obvious love for Sarah that Tom felt his last reservations about his future son-in-law disappear completely. This was a man who would treasure Sarah, who would protect her and support her dreams and give her the stability that Tom's own generation had sometimes struggled to provide. As they reached the altar, Father Miguel stepped forward with the traditional words, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Tom's voice was strong and clear as he replied, "Her mother and I do." Then he turned to Sarah, lifting her veil with trembling hands to kiss her forehead gently. "I love you, sweetheart," he whispered, Be happy." "I love you too, Dad," Sarah whispered back, and Tom heard in her voice the complete forgiveness he'd been seeking for 2 years. Tom placed Sarah's hand in Michael's, symbolically transferring his role as her protector to the man who would love her for the rest of her life. Then he stepped back, Scout moving with him in perfect synchronization, and took his place in the front pew beside Linda and her companion. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Father Miguel spoke about love and commitment, about the sacred bond between two people who choose to face life's challenges together. Sarah and Michael exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises filled with humor and tenderness that had many guests reaching for tissues. When they kissed as husband and wife, the cathedral erupted in applause, and Joy Scout remained perfectly behaved throughout the entire service, sitting quietly at Tom's feet, his attention focused on the altar, as if he understood the gravity of what was taking place. Occasionally, he would look up at Tom with those intelligent brown eyes, offering silent reassurance that everything was proceeding exactly as it should. The reception at the Phoenician resort was elegant beyond anything Tom had experienced in years. The ballroom was decorated with white roses and flowing silk, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables set with fine china and gleaming silverware. Tom found himself seated at the family table, Scout lying quietly beside his chair, both of them accepted without question as part of Sarah's inner circle. During cocktail hour, Tom was approached by person after person Sarah's college friends, Michael's family, old acquaintances who'd known him in better times. Each conversation was a small victory, evidence that he could hold his own in social situations, that he was still capable of being the kind of man who belonged at elegant gatherings. "You must be so proud," said Michael's mother, a gracious woman, who'd welcomed Sarah into her family with obvious affection. "Sarah is such a remarkable young woman." "She is," Tom agreed. "She got her strength from her mother, but I like to think I contributed something to her character." "I'm sure you did. And Scout is just wonderful. Michael told me about how he helped you through a difficult time. Dogs have such wisdom, don't they?" Scout, as if summoned by his name, looked up from his resting position and offered his most charming expression. Michael's mother was immediately smitten, kneeling down to pet him despite her elegant dress. When it came time for the father of the bride's speech, Tom rose from his seat with his heart pounding but his hands steady. Scout remained lying beside his chair, but Tom could feel the puppy's supportive presence like an anchor in stormy seas. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate Sarah and Michael," Tom began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's excellent acoustics. 26 years ago, when Sarah was born, I held her in my arms and promised I would always be there for her, always protect her, always love her unconditionally." He paused, his eyes finding Sarah at the head table, her face radiant with happiness. "And love. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I kept that promise perfectly. There were times when I failed her, times when I wasn't the father she deserved. But Sarah taught me something about forgiveness, about second chances, about the kind of love that persists even when it's tested." Tom's voice grew stronger as he continued. 3 months ago, I found an abandoned puppy behind a dumpster. He was scared, hurt, and had every reason to distrust humans. But somehow, we saved each other. Scout taught me that it's never too late to start over. Never too late to become the person or the father you were meant to be. Scout's ears perked up at hearing his name, and several guests chuckled softly at his obvious intelligence. "Sarah, you gave me the greatest gift imaginable when you invited me to be here today. You could have let my mistakes define our relationship forever, but instead you chose to believe that people can change, that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Michael, you're getting a woman who understands the power of forgiveness, the importance of family, and the strength that comes from choosing hope over despair." Tom raised his glass, his eyes bright with tears of joy rather than sorrow. "To Sarah and Michael and to the family that Scout and I are honored to be part of. May your love story be filled with all the second chances and new beginnings that make life beautiful." The ballroom erupted in applause, and Tom saw that there wasn't a dry eye at the head table. Sarah was crying openly, her makeup be damned, while Michael squeezed her hand and smiled at Tom with genuine affection and respect. As the evening continued, Tom found himself dancing with Sarah to "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song he'd danced to with her at her 8th grade graduation. She felt so light in his arms, so happy and secure, that Tom knew with absolute certainty that every struggle of the past 2 years had been worth this single, perfect moment. "Thank you, Dad," Sarah whispered as they swayed together, "for fighting your way back to us, for bringing Scout, for being here." "Thank you for not giving up on me," Tom replied, "for believing I could be better." When the song ended, Sarah hugged him tightly, and Tom knew that their relationship had been not just restored, but strengthened by everything they'd endured. They were father and daughter again, but also 2 adults who'd learned that love could survive almost anything if both people were willing to do the hard work of healing. Scout spent the evening charming every guest he met, accepting pats and praise with the grace of a born diplomat. Children gathered around him, delighting in his gentle nature and obvious intelligence. Adults marveled at his perfect behavior and the obvious bond between him and Tom. As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Tom found himself standing with Sarah and Michael, Scout sitting contentedly at his feet. "This was perfect," Sarah said, looking around the ballroom with satisfaction. "Everything I dreamed it would be." "It was perfect because you were here," she added, looking directly at Tom. "Both of you." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor, and Tom reached down to scratch behind his ears. In a few hours, they would return to Jake's house to their temporary but comfortable accommodations. Tomorrow, Tom would go back to work, continue building the stable life that had made today possible. But tonight, in this moment, surrounded by family and love and the kind of happiness he'd thought was lost forever, Tom felt complete in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He was a father again. He was part of a family again. And Scout, the abandoned puppy who'd saved his life, was right there beside him, living proof that the most beautiful stories often begin in the darkest places. 6 months after Sarah's wedding, Tom sat in his small but comfortable apartment, watching Scout play with a new toy, a stuffed duck that squeaked with each enthusiastic shake. The apartment wasn't much by most standards, just a 1-bedroom unit in a modest complex near his job site, but it represented something Tom had thought he'd lost forever: home. The walls were decorated with photographs from the wedding, images that captured not just Sarah's happiness, but Tom's transformation. From broken man to proud father. His favorite was a candid shot of him and Scout walking down the cathedral aisle, both of them focused and dignified, partners in the most important mission of their lives. Scout had grown considerably in the months since their first meeting, filling out into a magnificent golden retriever whose intelligence and gentle nature impressed everyone he met. The scars on his neck had faded to thin white lines, barely visible beneath his lustrous coat, and his eyes held the confident happiness of a dog who never doubted his place in the world. Tom's 1-year sobriety chip sat on the kitchen counter, a bronze medallion that represented 365 days of choosing hope over despair, connection over isolation, responsibility over self-pity. The chip had been presented to him at a meeting where he told his story, not just the story of his fall, but the story of his rescue by a puppy who'd needed rescuing himself. "It's amazing how saving something else can save yourself," he'd told the group, Scout lying quietly at his feet throughout the meeting. Several members had approached him afterward, sharing their own stories of pets who provided the motivation and companionship necessary for recovery. The construction job had evolved into something approaching a career again. Jake had been promoted to regional supervisor and had recommended Tom for his replacement as site foreman. The promotion had come with a significant raise and the kind of professional respect Tom had forgotten he was capable of earning. More importantly, it had given him the stability to plan for a future that extended beyond simple survival. Dr. Martinez knocked on the door at precisely 7 p.m., as she had every Friday evening for the past 3 months. She'd become more than Scout's veterinarian. She'd become Tom's closest friend, and increasingly, something that felt like family. She brought groceries for their weekly dinner together, insisting that a man who worked construction all week deserved a home-cooked meal. On Friday nights, "How are my favorite boys?" she asked, as Scout bounded over to greet her with his usual enthusiasm. "We're good," Tom replied, and meant it in a way that still surprised him sometimes. Scout learned a new trick this week. "Show her, boy." Scout immediately demonstrated his latest skill, rolling over and playing dead when Tom pointed his finger like a gun and said, "Mang." Dr. Martinez applauded appropriately, and Scout revived himself with obvious pride in his performance. "He's ready for his therapy dog certification," Dr. Martinez said, settling into the comfortable chair Tom had bought specifically for her visits. "I talked to the coordinator at Phoenix Children's Hospital. They're eager to have him start visiting patients." Tom felt a familiar surge of pride. Scout's natural empathy and gentle nature made him perfect for therapy work, and the idea of using their story to help sick children seemed like the kind of purpose that gave meaning to their journey together. "What about you?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Are you ready to share him with the world?" Tom looked down at Scout, who was now lying across both their feet, claiming his humans with typical golden retriever possessiveness. The thought of taking Scout into hospital rooms filled with frightened children and worried parents felt both daunting and right. "We're ready," Tom said. "Aren't we, boy?" Scout's tail thumped against the floor in agreement. Sarah called during dinner, as she did most Friday evenings, her voice bright with the particular happiness of newlyweds. She and Michael had moved into a house in Tempe, complete with a fenced backyard that she described with obvious intent. "We're thinking about getting a dog," Sarah said. "Michael grew up with German Shepherds, but I told him I'm partial to golden retrievers now. Maybe Scout could help us pick out a puppy?" Tom smiled, imagining Scout in the role of canine matchmaker. "He'd love that. He's got excellent judgment when it comes to character." "How's the apartment hunting going?" Sarah asked. "Found anything bigger yet?" Tom looked around his small living space, perfectly sized for a man and his dog, close enough to work that he could walk home for lunch to check on Scout. "I think we're happy where we are for now. Sometimes smaller is better, less to lose, more to appreciate." After dinner, Tom and Dr. Martinez walked Scout through the neighborhood, past other apartment complexes filled with people building their own versions of home and happiness. Scout greeted other dogs and their humans with friendly interest, his social confidence a testament to the security he'd found in Tom's consistent care. "You know what I realized the other day?" Dr. Martinez said as they paused at the small park where Scout liked to chase tennis balls. "You talk about Scout saving your life, but you never talk about how you saved his." Tom watched Scout investigate an interesting scent near a mesquite tree, his tail wagging with the pure joy of exploration. That was just doing what needed to be done. Anyone would have helped him. "No," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "Not anyone. Plenty of people walked past that alley before you stopped. You chose to see him, chose to help, chose to take responsibility for another living creature when you could barely take care of yourself." Tom considered this perspective, turning it over in his mind like Scout examining a new toy. Maybe she was right. Maybe the rescue had been mutual from the very beginning. Two broken souls recognizing something essential in each other. His phone buzzed with a text from Jake. "Barbecue at our house Sunday. Emma specifically requested Scout's presence. Sighed. She has a new trick to teach him. Tom smiled, remembering 8-year-old Emma's determination to turn Scout into her personal circus performer. The puppy endured her training sessions with patient good humor, seeming to understand that making children happy was one of his most important jobs. "We're invited to Jake's on Sunday," Tom told Dr. Martinez. "Family barbecue." "Family," Dr. Martinez repeated thoughtfully. Funny how that word keeps expanding, isn't it? She was right. Tom's definition of family had grown to include Jake and his wife and children, Dr. Martinez with her Friday evening dinners, the construction crew who'd accepted him as their leader, even the other dog owners in his neighborhood who'd become part of his daily routine. It wasn't the traditional nuclear family he'd lost in the divorce, but it was something equally valuable, a chosen family built on mutual respect and genuine affection that, as they headed back to the apartment, Scout walked between them, his leash loose and his stride confident. He'd learned to trust that his humans would be there tomorrow, that his food bowl would be filled, that his place in their pack was secure. His faith was absolute and uncomplicated, the kind of trust that Tom was still learning to extend to himself. That night, as Scout settled onto his bed, a luxury item Tom had purchased once he'd achieved financial stability, Tom reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been living in a van, drinking himself toward an early grave, convinced that his failures had made him unworthy of love or redemption. Now he had work that mattered, relationships that sustained him, and a future that held promise instead of merely the hope of getting through another day. Scout sighed contentedly and closed his eyes, secure in the knowledge that morning would bring another day of walks and play and the countless small pleasures that made up a dog's happy life. His breathing deepened into the rhythm of peaceful sleep, and Tom found his own breathing naturally synchronizing with his companions. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that their transformation was real and lasting. There would be children to visit at the hospital, where Scout's gentle presence would provide comfort to families facing their own crises. There would be Sunday dinner with Jake's family, where Scout would be spoiled with attention and treats. There would be another phone call from Sarah, another small confirmation that their relationship had not just survived but thrived. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of their shared home, it was enough to listen to Scout breathe and remember. The rain-soaked night when two abandoned souls had found each other in an alley and decided, without words, to hold on together. Some hearts are broken so young, they don't know what wholeness feels like. But Tom had learned something valuable in the months since, finding Scout. Wholeness isn't about returning to who you used to be. It's about becoming who you were meant to be, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one act of love at a time. Scout's tail thumped once in his sleep, as if agreeing with Tom's thoughts, and Tom smiled as he turned off the lights. Tomorrow would be another good day to be alive, another good day to be grateful, another good day to be Scout's human and Sarah's father and a member of the imperfect, beautiful family they'd all built together. In the darkness, Tom closed his eyes and listened to the sound of home. Scout's gentle breathing, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant laughter of neighbors, and underneath it all, the quiet contentment of a life rebuilt from the ground up with love as its foundation.